Did you know that some of the most cruel practices of slavery weren't just about forceful and hard labor? Beyond what you know is an even darker truth, one that is not taught in schools. Imagine a scenario where you are being perceived as a property instead of a human. You would only be valued for your ability to produce more property. This was the harsh reality of breeding slaves in America. It was a system that was designed to dehumanize, exploit, and make profit from black individuals in treacherous ways that most history books did not capture. This isn't just history, but a reminder that remains in mind and is not easily forgotten of how deeply racism ate deep into the fabric of society. Slave breeding wasn't formed as a result of slavery. It was a calculated and intentional act that was inspired by greed and white power. Yet, many individuals have no idea of what the full story is. Why? Acknowledging it means confronting a racial legacy that has severely affected black communities to this very day. In this video, we'll expose the history of silence and denial to reveal 10 shocking facts about slave breeding. Facts that your history teacher never taught in class. We'll not only expose these hidden truths, but also honor the resilience and humanity of those who endured terrible sufferings. Let's dive in. Fact 1. The systematic dehumanization of black bodies. Right from the very beginning, slavery wasn't just about controlling labor, but about controlling every fragment of black lives, including their bodies. Slave breeding was one of the most horrifying methods they controlled blacks. Enslaved people were not perceived as human beings who had thoughts, emotions, and aspirations for their future. Instead, they were belittled and compared to mere commodities for economic gain. As if that wasn't enough, they were treated like livestock to be bred and multiplied for profit. This act of dehumanization was deliberately and systematically strategized. Plantation owners did not just exploit the labor of enslaved people, they also exploited their ability to reproduce. Enslaved women were not valued for their humanity, but for their capacity to give birth to more enslaved children who would eventually be converted to property. This meant that enslaved men and women were completely denied ownership over their bodies and lives. One of the most dreadful aspects of this horrific practice was how it normalized viewing black people as commodities. Historical records show that enslaved children were often listed in ledgers alongside livestock, tools, and crops. How pathetic. Advertisements for enslaved women would sometimes include features of their breeding potential, which reduces them to nothing more than a commodity meant for profit. This thought wasn't limited to the plantations alone, but was also imbibed into laws, policies, and cultural attitudes. White society justified the atrocities of slavery and created a foundation for systemic racism that persists to this day by dehumanizing black people. This isn't just about knowing what happened in the past, but about recognizing how the dehumanization of black bodies was focused on slavery and how its legacy continues to shape the world we live in. This is why it's so critical to confront these hidden historical truths, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. Fact 2. Economic incentives for slave breeding. The abolition of the international slave trade in 1808 wasn't the end of slavery in America. Instead, it forced plantation owners and slaveholders to find new methods of growing and sustaining their enslaved labor force. Slave breeding was a calculated system of exploitation designed to maximize profits by turning enslaved black individuals into self-multiplying assets. Enslaved people were no longer just laborers, they became a renewable commodity. Enslaved women in particular were perceived as invaluable because their ability to bear children directly increased the wealth of their enslavers. Each child born into slavery was automatically enslaved for life. This made them become another source of unpaid labor or another stock to be sold on the market. Slaveholders developed detailed breeding strategies like pairing strong, healthy men with women who were seen as good breeders. These pairings were often forced without emotions or regard for consent or the personal desires of the individuals involved. Some plantation owners even resorted to employing rape to ensure the birth of more enslaved children. This was beyond just economic survival for white slaveholders, but was about greed and the relentless pursuit of profit at the expense of human rights and dignity. This vicious act left open wounds that continue to affect black communities today. Fact 3. Forced mating practices. Slave breeding wasn't just about economics, but was also characterized by control, power, and dehumanization at the most intimate level. One of the most alarming scenarios of this practice was the forced mating and labor of enslaved individuals. Plantation owners paired their enslaved captives solely based on physical attributes that they believed would produce the best offspring. Consent was never a factor, and the emotional and psychological toll on those subjected to this was devastating. Men who were enslaved were often referred to as studs, a term that stripped them of humanity and reduced them to their reproductive capabilities. These men were forced to impregnate multiple women, usually in dozens. It became an integral part of the plantation's breeding strategy. Enslaved women, on the other hand, were forced into relationships with men they didn't choose or subjected to sexual violence from their enslavers. Plantation owners would monitor the reproductive cycles of enslaved women and treat them like breeding stock. If a woman failed to conceive, she might be punished, sold, or exchanged with someone deemed more fertile. Those who bore children were often forced back into labor shortly after giving birth, with no time to recover physically or emotionally, or even heal from the pain of childbirth. This wasn't just a violation of the black bodies, but a theft of their autonomy and humanity. Families and genuine relationships were destroyed by this practice. They had no control over their most personal choices, and any attempts to resist could lead to brutal punishment. Fact 4. Sexual exploitation of enslaved women. One of the most horrific aspects of slave breeding was the act of sexual exploitation of enslaved women. These women were extremely oppressed, treated as property, and subjected to relentless gendered violence. Enslaved women were often raped by their owners, overseers, and other white men in upper positions of power. This act wasn't just an assertion of control, but also to force pregnancies that would bring more enslaved children. For white enslavers, this sexual violence was both a tool and a strategy. Enslaved women were perceived as reproductive assets whose children could either serve as future laborers or be sold for profit. This commodification of black women's bodies kept their lives under threat of sexual violence. The power imbalance made enslaved women defenseless. Any move to refuse or resist could result in severe punishment like physical beatings or being sold away from their families. Even young girls were not exempted, with many enslaved women subjected to sexual exploitation from a very young age. Enslaved women usually faced additional cruelty when their children were taken away from them and sold to other plantations. This tore apart any sense of maternal connection or stability between them and their children. Fact 5. The role of laws and policies. The institution of slavery in America wasn't just upheld by brute force, but was fostered by laws and policies deliberately designed to propagate racial oppression and economic exploitation. One of the most insidious examples is the doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, a legal principle that was established in colonial Virginia in 1662. This law stated that the status of a child followed that of the mother, meaning that if a woman was enslaved, her child would also be enslaved at birth. This policy promoted the practice of slave breeding. Enslavers were motivated to force enslaved women to bear children, because every child born increased their property without the need for purchase since it was already made legal. It was a self-sustaining system that turned black lives into commodities and also entrenched slavery as an inheritable condition. Other laws further supported this inhumane practice. Slave codes across the South ensured that enslaved people had no legal rights to their bodies, marriages, or families. These legal policies meant that enslavers could exploit and control reproduction without fear of consequences. Women who were raped by their enslavers had no recourse to justice, and children born from these acts of violence were often claimed as assets by their father enslavers. The underground nature of these policies shows how deeply slavery was intertwined with the legal fabric of the United States. These laws were not accidental, but stated to sustain white supremacy and the economic benefits of slavery. Fact 6. The breaking of black families. One of the most horrific aspects of slave breeding was its deliberate destruction of black family lines. Enslaved people were denied the right to build legally recognized families, and any bonds they managed to build were at risk of being destroyed. This was not one of those coincidental characteristics of slavery, but a deliberate, well-planned tactic to control and dehumanize black people. The breeding system was a complete disregard for familial connections. Enslaved men, women, and children could be separated at any moment, and often sold to different plantations hundreds of miles away, so they have no hope of reconnecting with one another. Mothers were being forced to watch as their children were taken from them and sold to other enslavers. Fathers were similarly stripped of their ability to protect or provide for their families, as they were reduced to that of laborers or breeders. Plantation owners saw these separations as a means of maintaining control. As they destroyed the bonds between families, they ensured that enslaved people remained emotionally isolated and less likely to organize or rebel. The destruction of families also ignited the idea that enslaved people were merely property and were incapable of building the same emotional or social bonds as their white enslavers. The psychological consequences of these separations were so severe. Testimonies from formerly enslaved people exposed the depth of the lasting trauma of losing loved ones. For many, the memory of a lost child, spouse, parent, or loved one was a wound that remained open. The breaking of families became a barrier to fostering cultural continuity, as traditions, languages, and histories became lost in the chaos of these forced separations. This planted seeds of generational trauma that continue to affect Black communities today and contribute to the disparities in wealth, education, and social stability. Fact 7. Resistance and rebellion against breeding practices. Enslaved people were not passive victims of the atrocities they went through. They resisted and fought against the horrors of slave breeding to the best of their strength, regardless of the overwhelming power of the system that intends to control every aspect of their lives. Enslaved men and women displayed incredible resilience and courage in their efforts to resist forced reproduction and reclaim autonomy over their bodies. Sabotage became one of the most common forms of resistance. For instance, enslaved women would sometimes use herbal knowledge to induce miscarriages or prevent pregnancies. With the help of this approach, they laid their enslavers' efforts to exploit their reproductive abilities all to waste. They also had other forms of resistance, like refusing to comply with forced pairings or engaging in clandestine relationships of their choosing. Escape was another form of resistance. Enslaved people would flee plantations to seek freedom and also to escape forced breeding. Although these journeys were very dangerous, they symbolized a refusal to accept the dehumanizing conditions imposed upon them. Acts of rebellion were not always individual. They sometimes had communal elements. Enslaved people supported and protected each other and shared knowledge and strategies to resist their oppressors. These acts of solidarity were vital in sustaining hope and a sense of humanity amid these relentless brutalities. Resistance to slave breeding was a testament to the enduring spirit and resilience of Black people during slavery. Their actions, which are often carried out in secrecy and at great personal risk, were bold declarations of their humanity in the face of a system determined to strip it away. By liking this video, we honor the strength and courage of those who fought against the dehumanization of slave breeding. Fact 8. The impact on Black motherhood. The practice of slave breeding had a significant and harrowing impact on Black motherhood. Enslaved women were forced to bear children out of excruciating pain and torture, instead of love or choice, but as a means of profit for their enslavers. The experience of motherhood for these women was filled with unimaginable pain, as the natural joys of raising a child were dominated by the constant threat of separation and exploitation. For enslaved mothers, pregnancy was not a reason for celebration, but a reminder of the oppression and pain they go through. They were sometimes forced to continue heavy physical labor throughout their pregnancies, and many were subjected to abuse even in their most vulnerable state. After giving birth, these women were often given minimal time to recover before being sent back to work. Most times they worked with their infants strapped to their backs as they toiled in the fields. Children were often sold to other plantations at a tender age, which tears families apart and leaves mothers to grieve their loss with no hope of reunion. For many enslaved women, this cycle of bearing children only to have them taken away became a recurring nightmare rather than a reality. Enslaved women lived under threats and fear of having their children sold. This was another level of psychological torment. Fact 9. The lasting psychological trauma of slave breeding. The legacy of slave breeding went far beyond physical abuse and exploitation. It left deep psychological scars on those who relentlessly endured it, and these opened wounds have been transcended through generations. The constant dehumanization, forced separation of families, and the exploitation of reproductive power had an extreme consequence on the mental and emotional stability of enslaved people. This trauma didn't simply vanish with the abolition of slavery. It became embedded in the collective psyche of Black communities and continues to affect them today. For those subjected to the horrors of slave breeding, the psychological impact was excruciating. Enslaved people had no control over their bodies, their relationships, or even their children's futures. Enslaved women in particular suffered a brutal combination of sexual violence and emotional distress. As they were forced to bear children they had no choice in conceiving, and often no opportunity to cater for. Enslaved men also experienced psychological trauma. They were often treated as mere studs for reproduction. Their humanity was denied and belittled. They were stripped of their roles as husbands and fathers, and forced to engage in relationships not of their choosing, e.g., and at the mercies of their enslavers. This emasculation and the loss of familiar relationship led to a deep sense of powerlessness and humiliation. This psychological trauma also had long-lasting effects on future generations of Black people. The trauma of slavery, including the brutalities of slave breeding, continues to manifest in the systemic racism and inequalities that we see today. Situations like the separation of family structures, economic imbalance, and emotional and psychological challenges are part of the inherited legacies of these historical injustices. These psychological scars of this era are not just stories of the past. They have opened wounds that still influence this present dispensation and remind us of the lasting legacy of racial trauma. Fact 10. The erasure of slave breeding from history. One of the most iconic aspects of slave breeding is how it has been systematically wiped off from the historical narratives. For decades, the brutality of forced breeding and its devastating effects on Black families have been largely overlooked or understated in textbooks, educational curricula, and public discourse. This erasure is a calculated approach of a larger effort to minimize the trauma of slavery and undermine the true horrors Black people endured. This intricate and cruel practice of slave breeding is often sidelined to the margins of history. This omission contributes to a broader pattern of minimizing the impact of racism and slavery on Black communities. The pain, sweat, and blood of Black individuals were swept under the rug to make slavery seem like a more distant, isolated atrocity, rather than the deeply ingrained system of exploitation that it truly was. This historical erasure has profound implications. This act also prevents future generations from understanding the deep, generational trauma that still lingers in Black communities today. In recent years, however, there has been an increasing movement to uncover and document these erased narratives. Scholars, activists, and descendants of enslaved people are working tirelessly to bring the history of slave breeding to light and ensure that the voices of those who endured it are heard and that their suffering is acknowledged. Although the process of historical reclamation is difficult, it is essential for healing and for making sure that the legacy of slavery is understood in its full brutal context. Thank you for watching. Share it with the first person that comes to your mind. Let's spread the truth about Black history. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more.